I want you to close your eyes and think about what this landscape would look like in the 1600s if you arrived on a boat and when you arrived on the shore, this is what you're going to encounter. Everything was woods. 96% of Connecticut was forest. And we had huge oak trees here, we had massive pine trees, and we had a lot of old growth forests. So that's what you encountered. There was no roads anywhere, there was no highways, there was no housing developments. That's what you walked into. Now the American chestnut accounted for about half of the trees that were in the forests of Connecticut. And the wood of the chestnut tree was prized for its insect and decay resistance. And it also was used, it made great fence posts, interior trim, and post and beam homes. And all the churches that were built in this area were built using chestnut in many cases. So a lot of the old meeting rooms of the old congregational churches in New England were built using chestnut. The chestnuts themselves are called hard mast by the biologists. And that hard mast provides a lot of food for the forest dwellers. And we're going to get into all of the wildlife that lived in those forests during the 1600s. Now, from the northeast of the United States down through the Smoky Mountains, that's where the chestnut resided. The black bear, now I'm going to tell you what wildlife was here at the time of the 1600s, and then we're going to get a little history of what happens from the 1600s up until the present time. And as we change landscape, we're also going to affect wildlife, and that's kind of the message of the talk. So the black bears were abundant in Connecticut. They were found everywhere, and they relied on the food and the shelter that the forest provided. We also had wild turkey, and we had passenger pigeons. Now we have wild turkeys again, but we have no passenger pigeons. We had elk, if you can believe it or not. Elk used to live in Groton, Connecticut, which seems hard to believe. We had white-tailed deer back then. We also have it today. And we also had a lot of moose in Connecticut at that time. These are two other animals you probably haven't seen around in quite a while. We had the wolf, the eastern gray wolf in Connecticut, and also had the mountain lion lived in Connecticut when the settlers arrived. So now what happened? So for the next 200 years, if you look at this artwork up here, people that came to this country began to clear the land. And when they did that, what happens, they made room for agriculture, and they had to raise sheep and other livestock. And also they used the wood for buildings, and also eventually they used the wood for railroad construction and also fuel. They heated their houses with wood. Also in this picture you'll see, or this artwork, you'll see the stone wall around the field. Stone walls were built throughout Connecticut. That was also to outline the property boundary for people and also to keep the livestock contained within an area. So what happens when you have lots of people coming into this state and starting to cut down a lot of these trees, the animals that lived in there don't have any habitat anymore. So in 1684, Connecticut offered a bounty of 20 shillings. Of course, we were an English colony. 20 shillings apiece for the killing of catamounts. Does anyone know what a catamount is? Mountain lion. That's a mountain lion, that's right. And by the early 1700s, the white-tailed deer population was pretty scarce in the state of Connecticut. Elk were gone, moose were pretty much gone, and the bounties were then placed on wolves, and the last wolf was a she-wolf killed up in the northeast corner of the state in the late 1700s. The turkey populations, because they rely on the forest, they began to wither away. By the mid-1800s, 1850, only 20% of the state of Connecticut had forests. So we had gone from 96 to 20. And you can imagine all of the wildlife that lived in those forests had no place to live anymore. So what happened is the passenger pigeon by early 1900s was extinct. That was due to over-harvesting. You probably saw the pictures of people killing thousands and thousands of passenger pigeons. And also they were killed because they had no habitat to live in anymore. Now also what happened is people thought if the American chestnut's a good tree, why don't we bring some other chestnuts in? So someone brought in an Asian chestnut into the United States. And what happened, you've probably heard the story, it ended up with the chestnut blight that pretty much began to wipe out the American chestnut. So the European settlers, when they came to Connecticut, they exploited the land. Unlike the people who lived here before them, the Native Americans took only what they needed, and they respected the land. So the beavers were virtually gone by the middle 1800s, and that was due to the demand for the pelts of the beaver. And also from the pelts, they made hats and they made clothing, and the Europeans loved the beaver pelts, so a lot of beaver pelts were shipped to Europe at that time. Also, the beaver skins, because they were worth so much money, that was the early American coinage. People that harvested beavers, that allowed them to get money to continue their westward expansion. And eventually, just like in Connecticut, we pretty much wiped out the beavers. So in 1914, in Union, Connecticut, some people said, we really need some more wetlands. We have no wetlands in Connecticut. We're starting to lose them. They brought beavers back into Connecticut in 1914. The beavers did their thing. They started to create wetlands. And then eventually, beavers were brought into other parts of the state, and they started to create wetlands. And that wetlands creates a habitat for other wildlife as well. Now the beaver, this is an interesting thing that the beaver does, and you've probably all seen the wetlands that they create. Once a beaver finds a running stream, they will dam the stream up, but they'll dam it to the height that allows them to swim with food and also to swim with material to build their lodge. Now what happens behind the dam, as you can look at this picture, the land behind the dam begins to flood. And what happens with that is it creates a habitat for river otters and wood ducks and other animals. So it's a great habitat magnet. When you have a beaver in the woods creating this sort of habitat, it's really great for wildlife. But not all beaver floods are welcome, and every year in Connecticut, the Department of Wildlife gets hundreds of calls because the beavers have built a dam, and now it's flooding into people's property and into people's basements. And if you're a farmer, it floods your crops and ruins the crops. So they have to eliminate a lot of beavers in the state because we have quite a population of them. Now the beaver is known as a keystone species. And what that means is a lot of other wildlife rely on the beaver and what the beaver does for them to survive and to prosper. So there's not a lot of animals that do that, but the beaver is one of them. So they're very special. This is a chart that shows what I've been talking about. From about 96% of the state was forested in the early 1600s. And you can see the 1700s, it drops 10%. Then it's down to about 65% in 1750, 1800s at 50, and then down to 20% at 1850. That's a lot of forests that were cut down in the state of Connecticut. So what happened in 1850 to turn this around? Anyone have any ideas?
Coal. Civil War.
Civil War was one.
Coal.
Well,
Energy source.
we had Industrial Revolution. So if you can get a job, work on a farm, you're working 18 hours a day. Now you get a job working in the Industrial Revolution, in the machining jobs, that sort of thing. People abandoned their farms and they went into these cities to get the jobs through the Industrial Revolution. They also discovered gold in California around that time. So people headed to California. And the Civil War that someone mentioned, people that served in the Civil War were given land grants to go west. So if they had an opportunity to have thousands of acres of land out west, they abandoned the farm in the east. So today, Connecticut is about 60% forested. So we're making our way back, but not quite back to the 90, but we're doing a good job. Although the red maple, this is a picture of a nice forest scene. The red maple is the most common tree in Connecticut right now. The oaks are also common, and the oaks are very important to wildlife. They actually provide food to 100 different types of wildlife, from bugs to animals. It's a very, very important tree in Connecticut. And the gray squirrel population relies heavily on the oaks and the acorns. And their population actually fluctuates. If there's a great crop of acorns, you're going to see more squirrels. If there's a bad crop of acorns, there's going to be less squirrels. So they can kind of adjust the population and the amount of babies they have based upon the crop of acorns. So the acorns, if you think back, we were talking about chestnuts in the 1600s. The chestnut blight came in and wiped out most of the chestnuts. So what it's going to take the place in the ecosystem, the oak did. The oak and the acorns provided food that the deer, the bears, and the turkeys used to eat. They used to eat chestnuts. Well, now they're gorging themselves on acorns. Now, the wild turkeys that we talked about were pretty much eliminated from the state by the early 1800s. Now that we're at 60% forested in the state, turkeys can actually survive. They have places, they have food, they have places to roost, they have forests to hide in, and they feel safe. So let me tell you how that happened in Connecticut. A rocket net. So from 1975 to 1992, Connecticut Wildlife went to New York State. They worked with the Wildlife Department in New York, and they captured turkeys that were doing quite well in New York State. What they did is they began to feed the turkeys in the middle of a field, and then the biologists would set up in a blind, and they would set up a net with a rocket on it. And then when the turkeys all started to eat, they'd fire the rocket net, and there's a picture of it being fired over the turkeys. And they're, of course, all trying to scatter. That net was captured, allowed them to capture the turkeys safely, and they did that continuously from 1975 to 1992, and they began to bring the turkeys back from New York State, and they spread them around the state of Connecticut. Turkeys did quite well, and as those populations began to expand in the state of Connecticut, the biologists took 300 of those that had expanded in the areas that they dropped them off, and they spread them throughout the whole state. So now the state of Connecticut has turkeys in every town, in every county, and the population of turkeys is estimated to be about 35,000 turkeys. So that's a pretty good story from 1975 to 2019 now. We have now 35,000 turkeys in the state. So where we get the money to get the turkeys in New York? This is a law that was passed in 1937. It's called the Federal Aid and Wildlife Restoration Act. What that does is the people who buy guns and bow and arrows and pistols or ammunition pay an excise tax on those items. And since 1937, the people who have bought those items have contributed $11 billion to these wildlife programs you see on the screen. And so and then what happens is, as that money comes in, Connecticut gets its apportioned share of the money, and then they create wildlife programs. They buy land if they can. They rehab certain areas. So it's money that we get from the sportsmen that helps the recreation and the wildlife in the state of Connecticut. Now, black bear sightings, now that we have forests, you've all heard the stories that black bears are coming back. Every year that we have more forests, the black bears are starting to make their return. Now, you see the tags on the ears of the bear? Does anyone know what that means? He's been in someone's kitchen. Well, that's what I thought before I took this course. And what this actually is this was a bear that these tags were put on. No, these tags were put on the bear when the bear was in hibernation, or it could have been a cub. So all the bears in Connecticut that have these tags on them, and they have 2 tags, and the tags will tell you which bear was tagged, which bear was the first bear tagged of the year, and the year that they were tagged. So from using a set of binoculars, you can see that this says G4. That is a code that tells the biologist exactly where this bear got these ear tags. This isn't a bad bear. It's a bear that they use for research. Now, this is a picture of Paul Rigo. He's a wildlife biologist. They currently trap and tag bears in the state of Connecticut. So that gives them an idea from a scientific standpoint of how well the bears are doing in the state. And anybody have any idea how many bears we have in Connecticut? Couple thousand? Anybody else? We have 800 right now. But they're increasing at about 10% per year. So they're actually doing quite well. And because we have a lot of oak trees here, and at this time of year, the bears love skunk cabbage, so they're in the swamps eating the skunk cabbage. So I want to tell you, I'll give you a little bit of science here. Most of the time, if a bear's in the woods and you're walking through the woods, the bear's going to either see you or smell you long before you see the bear, and the bear's long gone. Now, we have our little dog Fido, and that dog can smell 100 times better than we can. 100 times, that's pretty impressive. If you happen to have a bloodhound, they can smell 300 times better than a human being. And here's the kicker. The bear can smell 7 times better than the bloodhound. So 2,100 times better than you and I can smell. So if a bear gets a whiff of a human being and they don't want to deal with you, they're long gone way before you get there. So the best way, if you happen to live in bear country, to avoid the bears is feed your birds in the wintertime, but once spring comes, take the bird feeders away. And also, if you have garbage, make sure the garbage is secure. If you're in bear country, the bears are going to get to the garbage. And once they get to the bird feeders and they get to the garbage, they know that that house had garbage and had bird seed, so they start to break in, they start to become a bad bear. So you have to do everything you can to prevent that from happening. Does anybody know what this animal is?
Fisher.
That's it, it's a fisher. A lot of people have never heard or even seen a fisher. And the question I get on, does anybody heard a fisher?
Yes.
What does it sound like? Screech? Kind of. The animal that you hear that's screaming is actually a red fox. And many people mistaken that for the fisher. I've talked to the biologists in Vermont, in New Hampshire, and Connecticut, and they said for the most part the fisher hisses and growls, but they've never heard any sort of blood-curdling scream. There's some tapes on the internet, or some people on YouTube have said, this is a fisher in my backyard. That's actually a red fox that makes that noise. So the fisher is the second largest member of the weasel family. And they used to be all over Connecticut back in the 1600s and the 1700s. But what happened is we cleared the forest land, there was no habitat for the fisher to live. So the fisher, they were extirpated from the state of Connecticut, which means they were eliminated. People trapped them, they hunted them, and eventually there were no fisher left in the state of Connecticut. So that was around the 1900s. So they lasted quite a while considering what we did to the forest. But they like big tracts of land that are carnivorous forests or hardwood forests, and they typically like to make their den 20 to 30 feet up in a tree, in the hollow of a tree. And when you cut all the trees down, there's no hollows of trees for the fisher. So that's why the fisher left. They love to eat squirrels and rabbits and voles and other small rodents. And they're also one of 2 animals that actually can kill a porcupine. Anyone know what the other one is? Besides man, I'll just give you a hint. That animal used to be in Connecticut, but isn't anymore. Mountain lion. Mountain lion will roll the porcupine over and kill it from the underside, the belly. But the fisher, pound for pound, is a very, very tough animal. So now we're going to talk about how we brought the fisher back into the state of Connecticut. Here we go with the turkeys again. 1988, Connecticut sold wild turkeys to Maine because Maine didn't have their turkey population up to the numbers they wanted. We sold them wild turkeys, and then the money from that, we went to Vermont and New Hampshire, and we purchased live trapped fisher from those 2 states. And then we brought them down to the northeast part of the state, up in Litchfield County, and I'm going to show you a little story about how that happened. But this is a reintroduction. It's called a soft release. A soft release is actually when you take the animal, put it in the environment that it's going to live in, and the animal kind of gets used to the smells and the surroundings, and the biologists provide that animal with water and with food during a period until the animal kind of acclimates. And then I'll show you a picture here. So what else they do is some of the fisher were equipped with collars so they could track them. And you can see in the bottom left, that's an old tracking device. It almost looks like an old TV antenna on the old station wagons from the Department of Wildlife. So that way they were allowed to track, and they typically tracked the females because they wanted to know when they were in their dens and when they had their babies. So the fish have made their way back into the state of Connecticut. And the other thing that happened, this is kind of strange, they came from Massachusetts. I guess they came from Vermont into Massachusetts, into the northeastern part of the state, but they, for some reason, didn't swim across the Connecticut River, so they didn't populate the western part of the state. But now fish can be found throughout the state of Connecticut because of this reintroduction program. Here's our friendly coyote. The coyotes are very adaptable, and they can adapt to almost any habitat from the forest to the fields, and they've taken place, now that we have the dog catcher and we don't have wild dogs running around our neighborhoods in the cities, the coyotes have actually made their way into the cities because they've done very well. Even though they're not native to Connecticut, they're doing very well in the state right now. The first coyote that was reported in Connecticut were in the 1950s, and then in 1963, this is a picture of a coyote that was killed in 1963 in Kensington, Connecticut. Now the coyotes were persecuted throughout the country because the farmers and ranchers didn't like coyotes. So the interesting thing about a coyote is if you kill a lot of coyotes, they recognize that their numbers are down, and where a female may have 6 or 7 pups, when they're being persecuted, she could have as many as 19 pups to make up for the shortfall of people killing her brethren. So what happens is, the more, and they'll all survive. So what happens is that when they think they're killing the coyotes and getting rid of them, they're actually spreading more and more of them. And the coyotes began to spread across the country, and they came from the Midwest, and they came into Connecticut. So if you've looked at the coyote has anybody been in the West and seen a coyote versus the coyote in the East? What's the difference?
They're smaller?
They're smaller out west.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, they're quite a bit smaller. And the reason they're larger here is because they have mated with the Canadian eastern gray wolf. So there's a little bit of wolf DNA in the coyotes in Connecticut. And that's why when you look at some of the coyotes, they look very big because they have a little bit of wolf DNA in them. So what happened in Connecticut since we got rid of the wolf and the mountain lion, that was a predator gap. So the coyote now is basically filling that ecological predator gap that the wolf once filled in Connecticut. White-tailed deer. Now the white-tailed deer used to live in the forest, or they do live in forests, but they go to the fields to eat. And now you see the browse line in the bottom. If you love arborvitaes, the deer love them too. So these are signs that we have a lot of deer in the state. Anyone want to guess on what the population of deer is?
10,000?
Everywhere.
126,000 deer in the state. Now the other thing that deer can do is they can eat a lot of crops and landscape. They eat apples, they eat corn. So if you have too many deer, they can do a lot of crop damage, and sometimes farmers and sometimes people don't like that. If somebody spent $20,000 on plants around their house and all of a sudden they come back and the deer have eaten all the plants, they're not too happy about that. So the other thing that happens when the population gets larger is they run across highways and they get hit. We had over 4,000 deer that were reported killed by vehicles last year in the state. Now here's another interesting bit of information. The Department of Wildlife is suggesting that only 1 of 5 is actually reported. So the other ones either crawl in the woods and die, or somebody that might like venison saw a deer get hit, they throw it in the back of their car or their truck, and that deer never gets reported as hit. So it could be as high as 5 times that number of 4,000. We could have as many as 20,000 deer that are actually hit by vehicles in the state. Now the other thing that happens, the deer has such a high reproductive rate that in 2 years, we could double the population of deer in Connecticut. That's pretty significant. Now, when that happens, and if you have too many deer can alter the habitat in the forest. So all those young little trees that are growing up will never get a chance. The deer are going to pick them clean. And if you live here in Groton, if you've ever been to Bluff Point and you saw the damage in Bluff Point that they did, they basically are like weed whackers in the forest. They will eat everything around them. And a deer eats about 3,000 pounds of vegetation in a year. That's pretty significant. So what Connecticut did is they instituted a hunting season in Connecticut. So in 1974, the Connecticut Deer Management Act was passed and allows hunting of deer in Connecticut. It's a regulated law, so it's very specific on what type of ammunition, what type of weapon you can use to hunt deer. And every year, this brochure is published, and all the rules around hunting and hunting deer are published in that every single year. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about carrying capacity, because this really kind of comes in play with the deer. So for a deer, for carrying capacity, and I wrote this down because I want you to understand what this is. This is this is biological carrying capacity, this term. It's the maximum number of individuals of a species, so in this case a deer, maximum amount of deer that can exist in a habitat indefinitely without threatening other species in that habitat. So how many deer can live in the forest before they start to eat all the food of other animals and other wildlife? So there's another type of carrying capacity, and that is the carrying capacity called cultural carrying capacity. That's where we come into play. How many deer are too many for human beings? If every time I drive my car, I hit a deer, or if every time I look in the yard, they've buzzed all my plants down, I'm probably not going to be too happy. So the cultural carrying capacity, that's what that term is called. It's the maximum number of deer, in this case, that the human population will tolerate. So when the biologists make decisions on how many deer can be harvested or any type of wildlife can be harvested, they take into account biological carrying capacity and cultural carrying capacity. Those are two terms that you should know. Now, I gave you a great story about the forest. The forest went from 96 down to 20, and then now we're back up to 60. But there's other parts of the state that are now at risk, and this is called early successional stage habitat. So the shrublands and grasslands in Connecticut, because we're not really watching our forests and we're not doing a lot of forest management, the animals and the wildlife that live in these areas now are in desperate shape in the state of Connecticut. Because we have more forest cover means we have less grass cover, means we have less shrub cover. So some of the wildlife are vulnerable now because they don't have a habitat to live in. An example of that is the New England cottontail, the grasshopper sparrow, and also this is a bird you probably have not seen unless you've been up by the airport at Bradley. This is an upland sandpiper. It's a beautiful bird. They're quite common in the West where the habitat exists, but not so in Connecticut. And they've only found it in one place. It's up near the airport. This actually lives in Connecticut. But this particular bird is on the endangered species list in the state of Connecticut. The meadowlark is also in trouble in the state of Connecticut. It's listed as threatened because there are not a lot of fields for the meadowlarks to lay their eggs and have their young. Another one is the bobolink. Probably most of us have not seen the bobolink or the meadowlark in years. They used to be quite common in the state of Connecticut. Their numbers are declining in the state because we just don't have the habitat, and they're listed as special concern under the Endangered Species Act. Now, everyone loves to live by the water, by a river, by the coast, but what happens when you do that is there's a lot of wildlife that like to also have their nests and do their breeding along the shoreline of the state of Connecticut. So we're encroaching on the wildlife areas by building a lot of buildings along the shoreline in the state. These are the two birds that are really in trouble in the state. They're making headway now. They're making improvements, but the piping plover and the least tern, they have their nests on sandy beaches. And if you look at that piping plover on the left, right below her are a number of eggs. They blend in so well, you could easily, by the time you got to the beach, the bird would fly away, and you could easily step on the eggs and not even know you stepped on the eggs. And that's what happens. People don't know the birds have made a nest on the beach, and they love to go to the beach in the summertime, but they also are impacting these birds. Now the other bird is the least tern, and you can see the little chick next to its mother, again, blends in very well with the sand, and some people have even stepped or driven over these birds. People driving their four-wheel drive vehicles on the beaches have rode over these. Both of these birds are listed as threatened in Connecticut. But we have a hero team that's going to be brought in. Here they are right here. If you see either one of these birds on a beach, contact the wildlife department and they will dispatch wildlife biologists and volunteers throughout the state, and they will put up this in about an hour and a half. And what they'll do with this is they put this fence around this area where the birds are nesting, and they also put signs up. And a lot of times the volunteers will let people know there are birds nesting in the area just down the beach. Please give them their space. And then they kind of monitor the bird's health. And this really makes a big difference, and we're making some nice progress in the state of Connecticut because of efforts like this. Now, the other thing you have to be really aware of is if you go to the beach and you leave any garbage at the beach, what comes in when the garbage is left there? Raccoons and skunks and that sort of thing. If they're on the beach and there's eggs or there's young chicks on the beach and you left garbage there, they're going to get to these babies, and they're going to get to the eggs. So we have to be real careful to pick up after each other when we're on the beach. Now this is a real interesting one here. This is the Puritan tiger beetle. The population in Connecticut are listed as endangered, and they're listed as threatened and federally. Now what happens is the big rivers make their bends throughout. If you come down the Connecticut River all the way from Canada all the way down to the shoreline here, as the river bends, it throws up sand and silt along the edges of those rivers. And what happens is these beetles that's where they have their nests. But when people don't want a lot of flooding, they put up walls, they put up barriers, and they put up dams and that sort of thing. So what happens is all that habitat that the beetle once lived in, we're now basically putting up structures, and we're hurting the habitat for the Puritan tiger beetle. Now the other two that are in trouble are the spotted salamander and the wood frog. The spotted salamander is the most widespread mole salamander in Connecticut. But what's happened here is they love these areas called these vernal pools in the woods, where the water kind of trickles in and then sets up, and then they lay their eggs in these vernal pools. But what happens is, as we build and we develop, we put roads through. So now we have a vernal pool on this side of the street and a vernal pool on this side of the street. And what happens is these little salamanders and these wood frogs are crossing back and forth. They're getting hit by traffic. So they need a lot of area that's all vernal pools and away from roadways and away from housing and development. So because they don't have that, these two species are in trouble in the state. Now this is a wetlands. If you love wildlife and you want to look for wildlife, this is a great place to view wildlife. If there's any swamps or wetlands around you, it's a great place to view them. So Connecticut's a small state, but we have a lot of diversity in it. So I'm going to pop up the pictures here. What's this in the bottom right? Anybody knows what those are? Those are little sandpipers. How about that? That's a golden eagle, actually. We had one spotted last year, and the eagle count. And then we have what that is, eastern box turtle, and then this one lives. This is right up in Hartford. That's the fastest bird. It can dive 200 miles an hour. That is a peregrine falcon. But they actually build nests up in the high rises of Hartford, in our state. So we have some mixed hardwoods. Now here's another little test. Anyone know what that is? That's exactly right. It's a blue spotted salamander. Pretty easy one, right? And then we have our little friend, the chickadee. The chipmunk, sorry, the chickadee. And then the last one, see if you can pick up those tracks. Raccoon track. Very good. And the last two, what's that up in the top left?
Millipede.
That's a millipede. And the right, one of our favorites, the monarch butterfly. On the thistle, very great. That's great. So we have, even though we have even though we have a tiny state, we have a lot of diversity of wildlife, and we're really blessed to have this wildlife in the state. We have to do everything we can to preserve that. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you coming.